U.S. President Donald Trump's Middle East peace plan has been welcomed by the Israelis, but Palestinians have dismissed it as nothing new. Trump says his plan will enable Palestinians to achieve an independent state by doubling the territory currently under their control, but Jerusalem will remain the undivided capital of Israel. For more on this controversial peace deal, let's cross now to news correspondent in the U.S. and at the UN, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He's in New York as we speak. Sherwin, obviously this has been a long-awaited plan for President Trump to reveal. The issue of Jerusalem has always been a stickler point. President Trump talks about a Palestinian state, but he also talks about U.S. sovereignty over Western Bank areas. I'd imagine that has raised the eye of quite a few people.
Yeah, the West Bank is a very interesting element of this peace plan, because essentially of the West Bank as we currently see it in terms of the 1967 borders, which various UN Security Council resolutions point to as a guide towards a two-state solution. This plan would envisage 30% of the current West Bank, essentially where you have over 150 Jewish settlements, essentially regarded as illegal under international law, where those Jewish settlements exist. They will then be, in terms of this plan, allowed to be annexed by the Israeli government. In fact, Peace, I can tell you, we are seeing reports now that the Israeli army is increasing its presence in the West Bank, and there are big concerns that the Israelis could move to annex the 30%, those Israeli settlements, before direct negotiations even begin in terms of this plan. Remember, this plan is not a final document. It is a starting point. It's a blueprint, and Palestinians feeling that they were not part of this process, but also saying, Tsepiso, that this is a regurgitation of what they've seen from the Israelis in the past. In fact, let's listen to what the Palestinian chief negotiator, Saib Erekat, had to say, and Jared Kushner, essentially the author of this plan, the White House senior advisor and the president's son-in-law, had to say in response.
I think what President Trump presented yesterday was not an American plan. I think the American peace team copied and pasted the plan of Mr. Netanyahu and the Settlers Council's plans. This is verbatim what I heard from Mr. Netanyahu and his negotiating teams between 2011 and 2012. I don't think that the American team put a single word on this. It's about annexation, it's about apartheid, it's about departing the Oslo Accords and the agreement signed and international law, and it's departing the idea of making peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, so essentially they're speaking about, their disapproval in terms of the discontiguous nature of how this map would be drawn if this plan were to be adopted, Tsepiso. You're hearing words like Bantustans, a reference to how South Africa split up or segregated its population. If you look at the map that the Trump administration is proposing, you essentially get an archipelago of Palestinian territories that are not connected by land. There are tunnels that are connecting them, and essentially surrounded by the Israeli state. And to your point about East Jerusalem, you have the Temple Mount, which really is the centerpiece of what the Palestinians and the Israelis are seeking here in terms of any deal. And in terms of what we've seen in this plan, the suburbs of East Jerusalem that are earmarked for a possible capital of a future Palestinian state does not include the Temple Mount, which is the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, essentially the third holiest site in Islam. So you see where we are diverging here.
Showing the U.S. president saying that the King of Jordan and Israel will work together to ensure the status quo of the governing of that. Now, how is that supposed to work with no Palestinian contribution over the territory?
Yeah, that is the difficulty. Look, they're talking about maintaining the status quo, and that is overseen by the Jordanians in terms of control of the Temple Mount. Look, I don't know the answer to your question. Essentially, this is a blueprint that the White House has put out yesterday. We are seeking comment from various Security Council ambassadors. We were hoping to see the Palestinian observer to the United Nations come out and speak, but everyone very cautious in their responses, Tsepiso, as to how this might work. We were asking the U.S. diplomats if they intend to brief the Security Council on how they plan to effectuate this plan, but there are no plans to do that at this time. So a lot of questions surrounding the implementation of this deal, including U.S. proposals of $50 billion flowing to a future Palestinian state. They talk about, if you start negotiating with the Israelis, we will freeze settlement construction for 4 years. But settlements in their very own right, Tsepiso, are regarded as illegal under international law. In 2016, the Security Council coalesced around a resolution where the United States abstained to confirm that. So violations of international law included in this peace plan. How will the Security Council, responsible for the maintenance of peace and security, respond to that? Yeah, a lot of difficult questions, especially given that the United States has a veto on that council, Tsepiso.
And Sherwin, just what has been the reaction of the United Nations? So some have seen its response almost as a rebuke of President Trump and his plan.
Yeah, it was a question I put to Stefan Dujarric. I referenced this headline that said that the United Nations had essentially rejected, the UN rejects deal of the century. And I asked Stefan if that was an accurate reflection. He went back to the statement that he released to Correspondent yesterday, talking about, the role of the Secretary General here is to uphold the UN Charter. It's to uphold security and a General Assembly resolution. So in terms of that, these resolutions talk about 1967 borders. They talk about illegal settlements. And the peace plan we are seeing from the White House diverges from those prescripts that the Security Council and the Secretary General has to uphold. Steph was peppered with questions, Stefan Dujarric, the spokesperson, on how the UN would respond to this. And he's talking about how his boss, the UN chief, has to uphold those prescripts in terms of international law, which essentially puts him between a rock and a hard place, because they are very reluctant to PISO officials here at the UN to criticize this United States president directly.
And obviously, Sherwin, the Palestinians themselves are not too happy about this plan. Certainly some of the criticism has been its lack of detail on how some of the things are going to be achieved, especially when it comes to Palestinian independence, so to speak. What have they had to say largely?
Well, largely that they were not part of this process, right? You had President Trump announcing the details, some of the details of this plan in the East Room of the White House yesterday, flanked by none other than the Prime Minister of Israel, the now indicted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on charges of corruption in a Jerusalem court, as they were parading this peace deal at the White House. But, the Palestinians saying that they were not part of this process, while the Israelis played a very big hand. We've also now seen a reaction from the South African government, of course, a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And I'll read you just a snippet of what they're saying. South Africa maintains its principled position that any peace plan should not allow Palestinian statehood to devolve into an entity devoid of sovereignty, territorial contiguity, and economic viability. South Africa believes that it is only initiatives developed with the full participation of the people of Palestine that can achieve a lasting peace. And of course, the Palestinians were not at the table when this blueprint was developed. So really a big concern as to and a lack of clarity to PISO as to how they move forward and embrace or reject the plan moving forward.
What's very fascinating about it, Sherwin, is the US president saying that it more than doubles the Palestinian territory. Thank you very much for that update. SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease at the UN in New York.